like there's something missing in their simulation tools and their models, which is not translating on the track. Oh, well, you know, if you'd have just brought the lap cars in the lap earlier, then Max would have still won. Politics has almost helped to shape what we have now, which is that Red Bull seem to keep getting away with things that you could argue. I think the whole system needs to be looked at. The stewards are a vital aspect of the Abu Dhabi controversy that was overlooked, that also contributed to what happened.
Hello and welcome to Georgie's Stripping the Dipping. You're with your boy, DJ DENZ, because we're back at it again with some absolute bangers, me and Georgie with some excellent guests. And today we've got a really great friend and member of the community, being F1JORDAN. Jordan, how's it going, my friend?
Yeah, I'm doing great. And aside from the Formula One this season, I'm quite enjoying myself. I just got signed up to get a new house built, so personally, not too bad at all.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear on the personal side of life things are going quite well, because I echo your thoughts on that as well, Jordan. Just, we also look at Formula One, obviously Mercedes, to give us a weekly fix of wins and dominance and, just masterclass performances and strategy. Yeah. But this year, the W13 seems to have just been an obstacle to trade in relation to achieving some of those goals. But we will definitely get into that segment probably a bit later on into this episode. But before we get into things further, Jordan, a question I like to ask all the guests, and just as like an icebreaker as well, is, Jordan, where did your love of F1 begin? And, who were the top guys in the sport when you started watching it at the time?
Yeah, so to be honest, basically Lewis was the reason why I got hooked on Formula One. So when I started watching, I think it was about 2012 season, so it was that really tight season where anyone could have won it out of Alonso, Lewis, Seb, and JB as well. And I think I was watching one year Monaco Grand Prix in 2012, and that was where I first thought it was quite interesting to follow, but I didn't follow it religiously at that point. And then back into the 2013 season when Lewis signed for Mercedes, I got much more hooked on it. And even though there weren't many expectations that season, I went to Silverstone, hoping to see Lewis win his first race that year. And since then, I've been every year and obviously watched religiously. And that was kind of a good place to start, I guess, because at that point, Lewis was just about to basically transform his career and start his dominant period in the sport. So, that's where it all started for me, really.
Excellent. And man, you joined probably one of the most fascinating times there, Jordan, because you mentioned 2012. I think that was the year when we had 7 or 6 world champions on the grid at the time. We had Lewis, we had Alonso, we had Seb Vettel, we had Michael Schumacher, we had Kimi. I'm sure I'm leaving somebody out there as well, but we had multiple different world champions that could have all at some stage have gone for that championship, as you mentioned as well. And then, Jordan, I think you joined at just the amazing time to follow Lewis's transitionary kind of period, because then obviously in 2013 he replaces Michael Schumacher at Mercedes. And although I guess the expectations weren't too high because they were restructuring the company at that point, I think Toto Wolff had joined in 2013 too. And even then, we'd seen uplift in some of the performances. Lewis managed to win that race at Hungary, which was phenomenal, with his tire management and preservation in that race. And there were loads of standout performances for the team in that year as well, obviously before the hybrid era, which we all know and love up until this stage, with the absolute Mercedes dominance. So I'm right on there with you as well there, Jordan. And great times there too, great memories. So kind of first question I wanted to get into, Jordan, and on the topic of me being DJ DENZ, I'm going to rewind like Craig David. I'm going to go back a couple of months, maybe to not such a favorable time, but my first kind of experiences and kind of first time seeing you just within the F1 community, Jordan, was the whole Abu Dhabi kind of disastrous monstrosity.
Absolutely.
What I would say, Jordan, as well is just, huge shout out to you, because I feel that for the fan base and just the sport, our voices were being suppressed, and there were lots of kind of media agencies that weren't really giving it the time of day. F1 themselves were trying to brush it underneath the carpet, and they weren't really trying to, like, address the elephant in the room of such. And you have such a like articulate and really respectful way of putting things across, and they're very factual as well. So kind of where I was going with this one, Jordan, was just, yeah, could you go back, like, and tell us just what the emotions were like at the time when you were calling out the injustices of the
Yeah,
FIA in their reasoning, and like also just like having discussions with the likes of Damon Hill, which again, at the
yeah,
time
yeah,
it
yeah.
seemed that he was one of those people that was sitting on the fence, but then you sir, you managed to actually kind of like make him see it from the other side of the pond and see that what was going on was not right.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, when it initially happened, it was just kind of like sheer disbelief, like everyone went through. Especially when you've missed so much time in the sport, and it's on the last lap, and then you see the regulations being ultimately disobeyed at that very moment. Like I guess some people weren't aware of that, so they wouldn't have been specifically clued up on how the safety car procedure usually works, because they're kind of just like they just let it happen. But at the time I was aware, I was like, this is not right at all. They're completely disregarding what usually happens. So obviously, once he got over that shock, it was just months of kind of like anger, really, channeling that anger in a way where I guess I was trying to get people to see and understand it, mostly because and I think there are still people now who don't fully understand, and you still see people going like, oh well, if you'd have just brought the lap cars in the lap earlier, then Max would have still won. But if you actually look at the timeline of events, you can quite easily narrow down that ultimately Lewis was robbed, and either he should have left those cars in place, or the race should have ended behind the safety car. Those are the only two scenarios that were ever likely. And obviously, the one that was chosen was one that isn't possible by the sporting regulations. And to me, it was just mostly a frustration that a lot of people still didn't seem to understand it on the other side. So I was just trying to articulate mostly why the rules have been broken, and almost why you need rules in sport, because sometimes the excuses were kind of like, oh well, Max deserved the championship, or oh well, the race shouldn't have ended. The best championship we've had in a decade shouldn't have ended behind a safety car and things like that. But you got to look at it from the perspective of what was right and what was just, and what makes sport, and that's rules. And yeah, so I kind of just went with that, because ultimately these were all frustrations. It's all from a real place, really. And yeah, the Sky thing, where I managed to get Sky to interact with me and then change the whole outlook of Damon Hill and things with that argument was it was a crazy time, because although it went viral and got tons of interactions, at the same time I had to like deal with a lot of abuse that came off the back of that. So it was really basically changed kind of like my entire experience on Twitter. Since then, it's never been quite the same. But I think they say that when she passed a certain threshold of like followers, that due to the nature of the way the algorithms work, that you tend to attract a lot more of a wider audience of people who don't follow you. And since then, it's never been quite the same. But I'm still really glad I managed to have that like moment where I managed to at least persuade some people into that were not on board before, into realizing that okay, something unjust had gone off here, really. And yeah, it was an interesting time for sure.
Absolutely, there, John. I agree with all the points that you've made there too, because to a lot of people, that would have been actually their first time watching the sport, and this whole championship had been like bigged up and blown out of proportion as, the biggest ones you need to watch, just because it was the one championship where, like, Lewis wasn't like, at least the favored one throughout the entire season, I guess, with the performance that fluctuated of the W12 that year. But of course, as
Yeah.
well, like you mentioned too, like we as like a community were super happy to see the work that you were doing and just to see how, like, again, it really comes down to articulation, how well you'd put across those points, to the media outlets like Sky, like Damon Hill, and the points that you made, they were so succinct, but even like a lay person that didn't really understand the sport or watch the sport for as many years as you or I could understand that something fundamentally was not right. And yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
another key kind of talking point I wanted to get in there as well, whilst we're on the topic of it, is you got obviously a lot of support from the likes of me and the rest of like the community, the 44 and whatnot as well. But sadly as well, you mentioned that you got a lot of unjust abuse, which I feel is wrong and really terrible, that in the 21st century people feel like they have to waste their lives, they have nothing better to do. We call them trolls, obviously. They're just
Yeah.
out there to just cause chaos and just try and kind of like bandwagon on other people's like thoughts and stuff like that as well, Jordan. But the kind of question I wanted to put forward to you is, how did you go about dealing with some of that animosity and backlash and just borderline abuse from people? Because it's not easy. And a lot of listeners
Yeah.
that are going to be tuning into us, they either going to want to go into content creation, or they might be, outspoken like you as well. Like, and they might want to know, like, how do you deal with people like that? How do you block them out? How do you learn to adjust and exist in a space with silly people or really bad, negative people like that?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I'm still kind of learning to kind of not get involved and sometimes ignore, because I'm quite a person who interacts a lot and likes to, challenge people's views and things and reply. Sometimes I guess it's just not worth doing that. And more since that happened, I've started to kind of like discipline myself into just completely ignoring a comment, or at the end of the day, just blocking someone, because there's nothing wrong with doing that, and they might laugh about it, or claim it's a big achievement, but ultimately they're not contributing anything useful to your experience. So just get rid of them, and I think that's what I've slowly learned to do, to be honest. Um, and yeah, it's just about really realizing that you've got people on there that appreciate you. So what's the point in letting them ruin your experience, really? And I haven't changed my approach at all out of the back of that, even though it was, at times quite messy and yeah, nasty almost. But yeah, I mean, I'm still doing what I do, so it's not, you just get on with it.
Exactly. And I think, Jordan, as well, like, people can take a lot of power and strength out of the things you've just mentioned there too, because all of these trolls have nothing better to do. The whole like
Yeah,
MO, the modus operandi for doing these things is to try and like to scare people, or to try and like put people down, or to make them think less of themselves. And by you just continuing to like do what you do and doing what you believe is right, is a big message to them that no matter what they do or they say, it's not going to change the person you are and what you want to say and how you want to express yourself, which I think is like the ultimate stripe that you can give yourself. And I like tremendously respect you, for having such a thick skin against people like that. But then also, like
yeah,
you
thank you.
mentioned too, just you've got to be able at times as well to pick your battles. And sometimes if you see somebody deliberately just you know trying to be obtuse for the sake of being obtuse, then yeah, just ignore them, because at the end of the day, you only get a limited time on this earth. And what's the point of waste? If you could sit down there and look at the amount of times you waste on people that like didn't deserve to have your time, you'd be amazed. So like you said as well, sometimes it's good just to ignore people, and on top of that, use the mute button, use the block button. I do it sometimes too, because I noticed there's a trend where if I put something out for the first hour and a half for 2 hours, it's great. And then after the 2 hours, then I start getting, a certain fan base, a
Yeah,
certain
yeah,
selection of people out there trying to like thing. And I just don't care anymore, because at the end of the day, they didn't bring me in this world. They're not gonna take me out of this world. And there's nothing they could do to change my opinion, because I don't respect people like that at the end of the day. But also it's about self-preservation too. You need to preserve your own mental health at times. Mental health, I don't think, is spoken about enough, in today's society. And I still think there's a stigma around it, and people need to do what's better for them rather than actually, caring about what the masses think, or what, like, you know, the naysayers are gonna say, because there's always gonna be people that are gonna try and like slander you or tell you why you're wrong, or like just give you a hard time, because that's all they're capable of doing. So no, I think it's important we had that conversation, and thank you as well, you know, Jordan, for being so open about that too, because it's key. But without further ado, then we'll fast forward things to where we are currently. Jordan, we've got this Mercedes W13, the porpoiser, the twerker. She's just,
Yeah.
it's a really difficult car because we've seen glimpse. You know what? Like, I know like it's gonna be funny, but like W13 is like that girl in school where like so much. You know, let me not even just make it about a girl. Let me just, it's like, because there's so many different preferences these days. It's like when you're in school and you have that person that you fancy and like they're so amazing and like they just look good, and like on paper they should tick all the boxes. And then you're like, cool, the potential is there, but then actually when you go on a date, you just start seeing like completely different things that you wouldn't have thought or imagined. And like, I guess for a layperson that's a good comparison, but bringing it back to the technical side of Formula One, this W13 hasn't lived up to the expectations any Mercedes for that matter should really live up to. And it's frustrating for Lewis because he was robbed of an A4 championship last year. We all would have thought, and we all would have liked to believe, that this would have been the year that, you know, we could have, nothing could ever redeem what happened last year, but at least we could at least get something, you know, in return. So it's frustrating from that aspect, and then also for George Russell, it's frustrating because imagine you've been through all the hard work of, you know, going through the Mercedes Academy, winning F3, winning F2, then all of your college, well, on the topic of school, all of your college mates, they get to pass their driving license and get to drive around in Lamborghinis or Red Bulls or you know, in Ferraris and stuff like this. But you end up having to drive like your mom's Fiat Punto, being a Williams, right? And then you finally get the call to like the factory team. And then when you get there, the car isn't kind of what it's been over the last couple of years. Just to bring it back to you, Jordan, like, what has your honest assessment been of this car? Do you believe that it's something that could be fixed for this year? Or is it a thing where they need to maybe focus resources on next year? But then to double barrel my question to you, Jordan, sorry for my ramble here, is ultimately the regulations are pretty similar for next year. So this W13, sorry, is pretty much a foundation of what the 14 will be next year. What's gonna happen?
Yeah. So I think that analogy is perfect, to be honest, because from what you hear, basically, in the wind tunnel, this car is like fantastic. So on paper, it's ticking all the boxes, but there's something missing in their simulation tools and their models, which is not translating on the track. And that I still don't think they have figured that out. They thought after Barcelona with that first upgrade that they were onto something, but since then we've come to Monaco and now Azerbaijan today, and the car, you know, is again is showing traits of being difficult to set up. They can't get the balance in the right window. So the issues with the car, it changes from track to track. So when you know, when they're trying to set the car up to perform in low speed corners like in Monaco, they were not getting that out of the car, but that was present in Barcelona Sector 3, and then they were struggling through the fast stuff there. So it's kind of like this car, there isn't a window they can get it into where all the performance they saw on paper is showing on the track. And I think that ultimately that is a big concern for them next year as well, that they still really can't explain why their wind tunnel models and their simulation models are wrong, which is what worries me. And honestly, I think if you don't have the tool in front of you during this season to bring improvements to the car because you can't trust it, they're not going to be able to sort out these issues this season. And I think this season is going to be now for the rest of the year an exploratory year where they're trying to answer why that concept does not work on the racetrack. It only works in the wind tunnel. So for me, I think that's probably going to be their priority now. And then once they fix that, they can have a much more successful winter and design a W14 that actually performs as it should. So I mean, to basically get to the main point for you, I think that now I've lost confidence that they will fix the issues this season. I'm hopeful that we can still get like a win somewhere, but I think if we do, it will be down to luck more than anything. So I don't know, the balls taking each other out or something, or the Ferraris colliding with the balls, something like that, something unexpected where Mercedes are best of the rest in that particular weekend, and out of that we can somehow scrape a win. Because other than that, I don't see, unfortunately, us winning on performance again this season. Which is a shame, especially after last year. But they are new regulations, and that's just the way it goes sometimes in this sport. Like if everything was perfect all the time, and the engineering never failed, then it wouldn't be as interesting as it is. That's just the nature that we have to accept. And over time, whether that's 2 years, whether that's next season, whether that's the next set of regulations, Mercedes will absolutely be back as a team. It's a question of when, not if.
Absolutely. Definitely second you on that one and echo your sentiments there, Jordan. And you mentioned a quite good technical point there too, with like the lack of correlation between the simulations and wind tunnel in comparison to the real life car. And I know also even before the Barcelona Grand Prix, they used one of the allocated testing days to kind of try and understand the porpoising and see kind of what they needed to do with the upgrades to make it like drive in a better window, I suppose. But kind of question I want to put forward there, Jordan, is Mercedes have the likes of Anthony Davidson as their reserve and like test driver, simulation driver. I know again this is more kind of in the sim racing field, but they also have the reigning like esports sim driver Jarno Opmeer.
Yeah.
How easy do you think it will be for them to kind of get that correlation, to kind of narrow it, that point down ultimately?
Well, I think it's not a question of the drivers or the people they have running simulations. I think it's the actual software. So essentially, it all comes down to a model where they're tuning a set of parameters which match to this year's car and what they've built. And in theory, that should provide a reflection of reality. But obviously, that's only a model, so it's not absolute. And in basically broad terms, it's projecting the entire world of physics down to a set of mathematical calculations. Yeah, exactly. And somewhere in the simulations that I assume have mainly not been changed from the previous aerodynamic era, there is some kind of physical interaction. For Mercedes, their struggle especially seems to be like between the aero and the suspension. So something there that's interacting between those two things is not accounted for, which was an issue in the past, either because of the way they built their car or just the nature of those aero regulations. And now that's been exposed with this new era of car. And it's also one thing that has basically led to all this porpoising that all of the teams are facing is the fact that the wind tunnel is actually capped at a set speed. I can't remember the exact speed, but basically, I think it might be 190 kilometers an hour or something of that region. And obviously, that's a lot lower than the speeds they actually reach on the straights. So the airflow that goes through the wind tunnel never reaches that velocity that you see in real life, and that's apparently part of the reason why none of the teams were able to predict porpoising, because they didn't see that speed at the end of the straight where they start to see the bouncing occur, and then especially braking for the corner at that speed. So it's kind of a limitation set by the FIA as well, which has prevented this from being forecast. And like George Russell, I think, has said this week that if it carries on being this bad and they actually can't find any solutions for it, and most experts seem to think that the solution lies in the suspension. So basically, it's caused by the floor flexing, which stalls out the aerodynamic downforce. But then because you're storing out the aerodynamic downforce, the car pitches upwards, and the fact that the suspension has no control over that means that this porpoising effect happens. So if you had something like active suspension, you could almost detect with software and sensors that the car was about to porpoise and then readjust the suspension, and then you wouldn't have this effect. And well, that's the belief anyway, or the theory. And then George Russell was saying this week that, this is getting ridiculous now. Maybe it's time to accept that something in the regulations needs to be changed. Because, you could absolutely argue that none of this is actually the fault of the teams just designing a bad car. And actually the regulation set that they've been presented on paper is not fit for purpose. I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable argument in my mind. And maybe the problem... the teams will find that actually none of them can get on top of this unless something changes with the regs, which enables this phenomenon known as porpoising to be corrected.
Yeah, that's a fair kind of shout there as well, Jordan. And just thinking about that too in relation to the porpoising, and not only just from the technical kind of point, why it's been a headache for the teams to get on top of it, and it's like a really big technical challenge that they're trying to overcome, but also in terms of the physical and medical side of it too. I was reading an article, I think, on F1 Planet about Kevin Magnussen crying out for some nerve pains in his spine, which could be attributed to the porpoising as well, which is not great. And the great thing about Formula One is due to the improvements in safety, we've seen the longevity of drivers' careers expand. But with something like this, it may actually shorten the drivers' careers if they're unable, to thing, or, you wouldn't want drivers to then end up having to, I know you watch Motogp as well, so I was going to say, have to end up taking multiple surgeries and stuff like that just to be able to, race these cars with something like that. So from that perspective too, do you think if the teams don't get a hang of it, or if it persists to be a real kind of nightmare for the actual drivability and comfort, it's something that FIA will have to take on board, considering, and that's another thing I want to stick in there, the FIA are always quick to say, and we'll circle back on this point too, that they're about road safety and they're about the welfare of the drivers.
Yeah, I think eventually, if this carries on, I think so they'll give it probably maybe the rest of the season and maybe next season, because obviously during the winter the teams will have a lot more time to look into how they can address this without changing the regulations too much. But after that, they will probably be forced to step in and correct it. Because, not only is it possibly a risk to the driver's health, and especially their spine and their back, it just looks bad for the sport, in my opinion, because these are supposed to be cars at the forefront of technology. They're supposed to be the best cars on the planet. And then you just look at the onboard and they look like an absolute joke to drive. And, you can question whether these regulations have delivered everything they expected. But certainly porpoising was not one of them. And I think the FIA will eventually be forced to step in after a certain amount of time. I think at the moment they're just waiting to see if some kind of team comes out with some solution which suddenly, that's allowed within the current regulations, that suddenly, solves all the issues. Because from what I understand, the FIA don't understand porpoising either. They don't know what triggers it. They're as out of the loop as the teams are, to be honest. So, the proposals that keep going forward of active suspension might be something they have to try and just try out and run with. But yeah, absolutely. It's something that does need to be addressed. And that's either going to come from the teams finding some genius solution, or it will be a change of the regulation eventually. I can't see it happening any other way. The 2026 regulations, obviously, there was talk of changing how the suspensions work in that. So maybe it's a case they just bring forward that change. But I guess we'll have to wait and see on this one. But ultimately, I think you're starting to annoy more and more people now. You could pass it off in the first few races as teething problems, down to these new cars that nobody understood fully when they hit the track. But the longer it goes on, the frustrations, I think, will grow and ultimately it reflects badly on the sport, I think.
Yeah, I agree, and it's fascinating to just see kind of where the direction will go. But I also, like, definitely agree with your points as well. The FIA need to stop being so static about it and start looking into solutions soon because, and we'll get into this later, but, they're always saying that we care about the driver's safety. They made this whole palaver about jewelry and, again, trying to improve safety. But then also there was this issue with the pit exit line, which again we'll circle back to on it a bit later in this
Yeah,
episode. But yeah, it seems a bit kind of contradictory that they're very proactive with enforcing and following up certain things, but then with this such a fundamental characteristic of the car, they've been very kind of removed from the issue so far. So it's intriguing. But also, just on the topic of F1 tech, and just maybe also something that maybe should be looked into, Jordan, is this flexi wing from Red Bull. Because honestly, like
yeah,
I came back from Leeds yesterday, Jordan, and I just saw the highlights of the first two free practice sessions. I genuinely thought that Red Bull might actually have wings and might actually fly off the circuit because the rear wing was flapping up and down like crazy. So, for the listeners at home, Jordan, could you explain this? What's going on with this experimental spec wing that Red Bull have brought to
yeah.
the circuit, and why the teams are obviously going to protest its legality, and maybe where the FIA will come into looking into it as well?
Well, from Red Bull's side of the story, they claim that it's mostly down to the fact that so obviously the Red Bull arrived into the season quite drastically overweight, and they've gone through a drastic weight saving exercise because that's costing them a lot of lap time. And this rear wing has been massively thinned out in terms of the strength of the material, and because obviously that costs a lot of weight that they don't need if they can get the mechanism working on this piece of material that they've got that's thinner. But they put this in, and they keep having this problem where essentially the flat won't stay down because the the material is so light, and then the load that's coming from the airflow as it goes over the straight starts to vibrate it, and it starts wobbling in a way that would not satisfy the regulations about movable aero parts. And this has been a recurring symptom of the Red Bull DRS mechanism over several seasons. So you can obviously say that they are always pushing the limit in that area, certainly more than the other teams are. And absolutely, I think if this was to continue, eventually it would be protested by the teams because it's a breach of the rule about gaining benefits from error that moves, which is ultimately what was the same regulation that was at the center of the Flexgate last season in Baku as well. At that time, it was about Mercedes and Red Bull and their rear wings. But to me, it's pushing the back. It's essentially just about how Formula One engineers always push the boundaries of the sport, and they'll try and get a piece as close to the edge as possible before it, risks breaching the regulations. And I don't, it seems like based on the running this morning that they've possibly corrected it somehow. Don't know how, but I guess their worst nightmare will be whether it appears or not in the race again, because that's when you could be at risk of being protested for running an illegal car. I think they'll be concerned for this weekend whether or not they can make it through the weekend without the wing doing that again. But ultimately, once we're through that, Red Bull have got to look at the mechanisms as a whole and whether the weight saving exercise was a step too extreme, and they might have to readjust that wing for future races. But obviously, they can't do that this weekend. So this weekend, they're basically walking on a tightrope, hoping it doesn't happen again, I think. But yeah, ultimately, it's just a case of them pushing the boundaries more than other teams, I think, which is what Red Bull and especially Adrian Newey have always done with the design of their cars. So yeah, that's what we're seeing, I think.
Yeah, and I think those are some really great and very insightful points there as well, Jordan. And actually, just to get onto it as well from the safety aspect, can I ask you, are you surprised that the FIA haven't really been more proactive in looking at this reoccurring Red Bull thing? Because I'm glad you mentioned it, because I remember even last year in Mexico, they're having this thing with the rear wing not like functioning or closing properly or opening properly, and then they sacrifice Perez to give Perez's wing to Max for qualifying, just to make sure that he was all good to go. The kind of angle I'm coming from, Jordan, is like, is it not surprising? Because if, God forbid, that rear wing was to get jammed open, for example, or to fail because of how, hard Red Bull are pushing with the material and obviously the way it actuates, if a driver was to go through a corner with that wing completely open, it could create the mother of all accidents. And I laugh from like a place of discomfort almost if such a thing were to happen. And another thing I'd also like to bring up, I know they're not like for like situations and people will probably be quick to point that out, but when Lewis Hamilton had a wing that reached the regulations by like something stupid like 0.0.03 of a millimeter, the FIA were there and ready to go. But with this reoccurring issue with Red Bull, it just seems to just go under the radar week in, week out. And it's almost as if like, the FIA to say, yeah, Red Bull, you do what you want, man. Like, as long as, you don't like annoy us until you continue to pay us the 50,000 euros, for every time Max touches a Mercedes, we're cool. Like, what do you think of that?
I think ultimately the difference with this is that the Mercedes issue that they occurred was due to a specific test that was defined in the regulations that they failed. So it's all like basically defined by these tests that are specified. I think for this particular issue that Red Bull are having, that isn't a part of any particular test or load test. So proving that there's illegality in this case is more of an issue, and it would come down to whether you can claim or not it's against that particular technical regulation. But they haven't, when it's put into scrutineering and they run all the tests on the cars, there isn't any particular element that Red Bull are currently failing against, especially when the car is sat stationary. So I think that's the difference. But on the point that whether or not, it could be a safety issue, I absolutely think it could be. And I think, the FIA are probably really concerned about that. They ultimately have their hands tied because, like I say, they don't have that particular case covered explicitly in any sort of regulation. So it's about whether, and especially during practice sessions as well, the requirements to run within the regulations are slightly reduced before Parc Fermé, and they seem to be less concerned about things like this during practice sessions. And generally, so far, Red Bull have always fixed this issue before the race. So I think if it happens during qualifying or a race, you might end up in a different scenario where the FIA suddenly asks them to, fix the mechanism or improve the design of the wing. But until now, it's been very much pre-qualifying from what we see.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Jordan. And, thank you for kind of caveating that kind of question for us as well, just in terms of just the legality of it and obviously the safety of it too. It's a good segue into the next section, Jordan, which is, what's your take on the budget cap for this year and like the teams going about like sticking under it? Because just to flesh out that question more, you've got Mercedes obviously with this W13 and it's really radical, like zero pod like concept. Had it not been for maybe the cost cap, do you think maybe they would have potentially gone into the season having two different specifications of car, like a more traditional one and then obviously the radical one that we have now? And also like with the likes of Red Bull too, like I think at pretty much most Grand Prix we've seen them like bring an upgrade. Do you think it's a thing where it might potentially affect the development race towards the end of the season as well?
I think the way the budget cap has mostly hurt the bigger teams is that they've had to let go a lot of staff, and obviously in doing that you can't have parallel streams of like research going on or development going on. So essentially everything's become very linear in the sense that you have to try something, it doesn't work. Okay, now we try the next thing, it doesn't work. Whereas before they had more power to brute force towards solutions. And I think for a team like Mercedes and the Red Bull as well, I think absolutely it has impacted some of their design scope for this season. And ultimately, I think it's boiled down to, who got it right out of the bat and who didn't. And Mercedes haven't got it right, and now they are in a sticky situation really, where they don't have much scope to carry on looking into what's wrong with this car. They can do research relatively low cost, but when you want to translate that into something to run on the racetrack, you are spending a lot of money in doing that. So yeah, the budget cap will have 100%, I think, had an impact on Mercedes, especially because as an engineering department, what their key strength was known as was huge strength in depth. Like if you think of Red Bull, then most people will always think of Adrian Newey, and they see a team where Adrian Newey is ultimately dictating everything from the top, and he is very much at the forefront of how that team moves forward. Whereas Mercedes, although they have people like James Allison and various big names over the years, a lot of their success has come from having a very, very large engineering team, which allows them to almost brute force towards the fastest solutions and fastest car. And they've had to cut down a lot of those staff members due to the budget cap. So one of the things as well that Mercedes have recently changed is obviously James Allison's moved out and Mike Elliott has come into that role as technical director, and James Allison is now above in like a more managerial capacity. He's also overseeing the Ineos boat project. And obviously this is basically Mike Elliott's first car as the leader. And that will certainly have an impact because he'll have his certain ways of working, and he'll have had lots of ideas about this new set of regulations, and maybe you have to ask whether making that change right at the end of a set of regulations into a brand new set of changes, which were the biggest we've seen in a long time, was the right time to make that call. And maybe James Allison should have been kept in that position for a while longer. And that's always something I've questioned as well. But obviously, ultimately, we never know what's going on behind the scenes at the end of the day. We can only guess as fans. But I just know that Mercedes ultimately is a well-backed team, well-resourced. Even if they are defined by this budget cap, they still have all the connections that a major car brand has. So if they have, problems, they'll always know someone to call on for solutions, and I think they'll never be lacking in talent down at Brackley. So it's only a matter of time, I think.
Sure. And also kind of a good other segue question to tie into this everything that's new with this season. Jordan, what's your honest assessment been of these new regulations, specifically with the cars and how they are to drive, and the goal which the FIA set out, which was to make them, one, improve the racing, and two, I guess, in a way, to reshuffle the pack. Well, you can kind of tell by my voice on the end of that one how my views on it. But yeah, what's your assessment been on that so far, and whether the FIA have achieved that goal or not?
Yeah, well, I'd say obviously the main one they were aiming for was the following and the dirty air. So while I do think it's clear that has improved, it doesn't necessarily translate into better racing or more overtaking, because it's still dependent on many other factors. So the tyres overheating is the main one that the drivers complain about, and certainly restricts the amount of grip they feel still when they're behind another car, especially after several laps. So then they have to back off to cool the tyres down and things, which restricts overtaking. But also, obviously, it's all about the field spread as well. So it's all good having cars that can run, on each other's gearboxes without any issues, without any loss of downforce. But unless there's a speed differential on the straights or whatever, ultimately you're still unlikely to be able to overtake. So you need to have differences in performance. And we're not quite seeing it translate overall into more overtaking, I don't think. I mean, if you look at the averages across races, some of them have been higher, but generally it's not actually that different. And actually, that the best season we ever had, I think, in terms of overtaking stats was 2016 regulations. And so far, these 2022 cars haven't got close to that number that's been achieved. And it makes me wonder if their aims are obviously also to have a much lower spread in the field. So they want all the field to be closer together. And currently that's not been achieved, with the midfield being about 1.5 seconds away from the rest of the teams, Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull. And, well, maybe not Mercedes, unfortunately, but generally speaking, the midfield is quite a distance away from the top two teams, let's say. And ultimately, they want that gap to be closed. They don't want big gaps between cars. They want to see almost a glorified spec series in a way. But the problem with that is that if that eventually does materialize, and I think it will over time, because generally you have stable regulations and teams keep on developing, they will get closer together. That's just naturally what happens. It's like the law of diminishing returns. The problem is then the field spread is lower. You're going to get less overtaking naturally, because then there's no performance differentials between the cars anyway. So, I'm not sure whether or not the current regulations will improve in the future. There are reasons to believe it might, and there are reasons to believe they won't. But overall, I think the FIA will be looking at them and thinking that it hasn't quite delivered the immediate impact they expected. And I do think that the 2026 regulations look a little bit more promising, because one of the other things that makes these cars almost so unattractive and so hard to drive is the weight of them. And they're massively overweight compared to where we were 10 years ago. And I think the aim is in 2026 to start looking at weight reduction and making more nimble cars again. Because if you think about the 2008 cars, those looked amazing. They were really nimble. They were really light. You could see, they looked skittish, and they looked more like racing cars than what we have now, which are big, fat cars that are just stuck to the ground all the time. They're very rear heavy and just don't look particularly good to the eye. So I think 2026 regulations again will be a step forward, and I don't see the FIA changing drastically anything about the 2022 regulations in the next 2 years. I think they'll just hang on and see how it goes. That tends to be naturally how these things go anyway. But 2026 is much more interesting for me now, ultimately. But if you want my personal opinion on it, so far I'm not that impressed by the changes, and they haven't delivered the excitement that was marketed from them.
Same here as well. I think I'm in the same boat as well there, Jordan. And yeah, just like, we obviously had the off-season stuff with the Abu Dhabi situation, which put already a kind of dampener on it for us. And then, of course, as well, when you look at the racing, when it's been like one or two guys, it's been cool. But then there have been other races, for example, at Monaco, where these cars just definitely just do not work there at all, and it's a thing where I think maybe some of the circuits we go to need to be changed, or maybe we don't return there. Also, like you mentioned as well, we've got newer regulations coming out in 2026, and the proposals and those would seem a lot more attractive. So it's definitely one we're gonna have to watch the space on. And without further ado, the next kind of segment I wanted to get onto as well was just 7, nearly 8 races into it, Jordan, in relation to this season. We've got Silverstone and, Spa and Hungary and those circuits coming up for the midpoint. So we're nearly halfway in the season. Sadly, I know it's probably not going to be Mercedes, but we can always hope. But realistically for you, who do you see as the favourites to win the championship this year? Because again, setting the scenes, you've got Ferrari, which have had that advantage of like being able to not have the intensity of a championship fight, being able ever since 2019 to kind of work on their power unit, like, behind closed doors, and obviously this SF75 as well. You've got the likes of Charles Leclerc, which is Hungary, and he's always been one of those touted as a future world champion. But again, Ferrari do Ferrari stuff, of course, and the strategy, plan A, plan B, plan C, whatever plan they run, it might not be plan Z today. Always seems to maybe catch them out. But then on the flip side, you've got Red Bull, and then, they also have a kind of ongoing crisis right now because they had some reliability issues at the beginning of the season. You've obviously got this DRS gate thing that keeps happening, which long may it continue because I just love hearing Mass complain on the radio. I feel sorry for his engineers sometimes. They really get an earful. And then obviously the next thing that we start seeing is the tire whisperer, the tire massager, that guy Sergio Perez just actually putting in some performances. And now that he's settled into that team and the characteristics of this car kind of suit his style more, even Red Bull now might actually have to, not by choice, but by force, have to actually consider Perez as a more serious candidate now. So who do you think is gonna have the final laugh by the end of the season, based on what we've seen?
Yeah, well, I think unfortunately, although it would have been really nice for Ferrari to sustain the championship battle over a season, the last few races have just convinced me that it's not going to happen. They have a very good qualifying car, clearly, but for whatever reason, it's just not as strong as the Red Bull in race trim, and also their strategy team is inherently weaker. I think Red Bull have the best strategy team on the grid, and they've had that for some seasons. They rarely get things wrong, especially with the marginal calls. They always seem to fall on the right side of things. And for that reason, I just think that they're going to struggle to win the volume of races that really the car deserves to be getting, to be honest. So ultimately, by the end of the season, I'd expect Red Bull to have a healthy advantage, probably in both championships. But I think there's a high possibility that by the end of the season, the actual championship battle, although it's been talked about as Max versus Charles, could end up being Max versus Checo. I mean, that kind of exists already, right? But as the headline, I think that could be what happens. It's been very impressive to see Checo's improvements from last year. And I see no reason now why he can't sustain a championship battle to Max over the season. Because if you think about, his credentials, his experience, his talent, there was never any reason why he should have been that far away from Verstappen. Obviously, it was just a case of the design of that car and the way it felt and drove for him was never perfect. But certainly when we come to this new era of car, for whatever reason, it definitely seems to suit Checo, probably more than Max at the moment. Max seems to be a bit more ragged the way he's driving it. And I would love to see Checo take the fight to Verstappen, especially because after the last season here, quite often people saying, oh, well, the reason why the gap's so big between, Checo and Max is because Max is unbelievably good. But, I never bought into that at all. There was never sometimes there was 1 second difference between them last year. And, you can't explain that as purely down to talent levels. It was obviously that Checo was having major issues with being able to exploit the car with his driving style. I mean, I just hope for the sake of it, to be honest, that somebody, whether it's Checo or it's Charles, can sustain the challenge on Max. But I think Max is probably the headline favourite. But who knows what will happen for the rest of the season, to be honest. It's going to be interesting to follow. But I can't say I've been as hyped about it as I would have been maybe if Mercedes would have been up there, for sure. But, at least there's a little hope that someone can dethrone Max and stop him from winning another championship. But, we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's a long season. And like you said, the reliability issues as well may creep into it, especially on the Red Bull side. So who knows?
Yeah, that's a fair analysis there, Jordan, and I agree with you. Being a Mercedes fan myself, yeah, it sucks, and then even you get those typical kind of guys, oh, for the championship, oh, for the neutral, well, for the neutral, I think it'd be great if Mercedes was there too, and it's a freeway fight,
Yeah, exactly,
so, that can be played both ways, but I agree with you, it's intriguing to watch, and whilst, for me as well, I'd like to see Ferrari kind of take it to Red Bull, And, Ferrari have been pretty much deprived of a championship since 2007 with Kimi and that kind of era as well. So it'd be fascinating to kind of watch how it plays out. And then you mentioned as well this ongoing thing with Max and obviously Sergio as well as the season progresses. But now, Jordan, and I think I'm gonna have to actually make this a segment of the show. Like it's gonna be called the FIA cookout, because Jordan, like every week, every month, every living day, every fiber of my body, I have to keep frying these guys. I have to keep cooking. It's like I'm at a wedding and I'm just catering for so many different mouths, because every week I have to fry these guys because they just do something stupid, or they just show no
Yeah.
consistency or coherence with what they're supposed to be doing, Jordan. And it's just, like, honestly, you know how there's a website called Did Nikita Mazepin Crash? They might have to make a website for me called did AMG DENZ roast the FIA this week? Because man, it's like they want me to roast them every week, man. But to kind of get into it again, Jordan, we've seen just this kind of incompetency from this new regime, this reshuffled regime, as they like to call it, with this whole 16 blue flags that were completely ignored last week,
Yeah.
which ultimately, I know that we got onto Ferrari and we said at the best of times the strategy could be a bit better. But having said that, there were some external factors, being that some William drivers, some guys on the Red Bull payroll there, they just didn't get out of the way. And normally, for any other driver, if you ignore 16 blue flags or more, that's a slam dunk penalty. And again, it was ignored.
Yeah.
And then, like, just to kind of flesh it out even more, you had this whole thing with the cars crossing the white line on the exit. And again, because the FIA were too lazy, because they're too redundant in changing the results, they've almost made a completely different interpretation of the rules just to kind of let the result slide. And I think you and also Brad Philpott, shout out to Bradley, you guys pointed out why their interpretation is wrong. And secondly of all, it could create more danger than how it would be had the rules just been followed as they should, which again is shades. It's shades again of Abu Dhabi. Like, like how Georgina's wanted me to phrase this question to you, Jordan, is, what's really going on with the FIA and these kind of weird decisions they're making? And is it fair to say that, there should be allegations that maybe their decisions, they favor Red Bull a lot more? Because again, just like Emma Ramble here, I think one good job that Christian Horner and Helmut Marko have done over the years is they've made out to the FIA that they bully Max and that they treat Max differently to the other drivers, and that, in Max kind of earlier years, they were giving Max kind of like penalties which cost him, like, a podium at Mexico when he overtook outside the circuit and then deliberately held up Sebastian Vettel to let Ricardo pass, or when he deliberately went off the circuit at Austin and then they took away his podium and gave it to Kimi. They've like planted a seed in the FIA's head that, that there's an unconscious bias, and I think the FIA really believe that, and it's kind of, you're seeing it now play out in the way that they go about their decisions. But of course, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think ultimately it's an organization that has more and more, for some reason, refused to take accountability for anything that happens. There's no, they are highly self-proud almost, and unwilling to accept any sort of criticism. I mean, even if you look at the stuff that the FIA president said this week, they haven't apologized for that. They've tried to brush it aside. They just don't seem to accept when they haven't done something correct. And obviously that, as a culture, is bad for a sporting body to behave like that. And I think to touch on the factors you're talking about at Red Bull, I think Red Bull have very smart lawyers and have two very political people running the team. And I think politics has almost helped to shape what we have now, which is that Red Bull seem to keep getting away with things that you could argue, you could easily argue a different case for when you review the regulations. I don't think it's necessarily favoritism. It's just how almost Horner and Marco and Red Bull's lawyers, Jonathan Wheatley as well, have ran things, and we unfortunately got into this state where it's becoming the norm now. In terms of the crossing the pit lane thing, I think it's absolutely bonkers. I mean, I don't understand why you would change what was a rule that had no issues into something that is now fundamentally less safe and worse and harder to enforce. That the whole point of the line is to separate traffic into two clear lanes. That's the point of it. You're exiting the pit, it's like you're going off the motorway, then you go into this lane. You're separated off from the rest of flowing traffic. That's the point of a pit lane exit and entrance being split by these lines. So why you would suddenly be allowed to dip the tire on there is just bonkers, really. And so I've seen numerous comments about this, alluding to the fact that this came from not wanting to change the result in Monaco. But I think it's arguable that the ultimate thing that's caused all this is, for some reason, Appendix L of the International Sporting Code was changed during the winter to define now that it has to be a full tyre that crosses over the line rather than any part of the car. Because if you use the any part of the car interpretation, then even the edge of the tyre is technically a part of the car and has gone over the line. So there'd be no way you could argue that Max hadn't breached that rule in Monaco. But they changed it in the International Sporting Code to something which is more open to interpretation, in my opinion. And the interpretation they've gone with in Monaco, and this is the first time exercising this rule, so I wouldn't necessarily say it's 100% down to not wanting to change the result. It's also about interpretation of the new rule. The interpretation they've gone with is that, okay, so now all of the tyre has to cross over this line. And reading the rule, that is, it does satisfy that rule, but then there are other ways you can argue you could read into that rule. But ultimately for me, it's just bonkers that they changed that, and they haven't provided justification why they did change that. And at the same time as well, in Monaco, they were talking about the fact that, well, they didn't change the race director's notes. They just copied it from the previous event, which is crazy. I mean, that's just like negligence, isn't it? Copying and pasting stuff and not actually reviewing whether it's relevant or not. And yeah, so they basically said that, well, the sporting code always takes precedence over the event notes. But then if you look back at some previous decisions in the past, especially things like the practice starts that Lewis did in Russia in 2020, where he got the penalties for doing it outside of the area, that area was only defined in the event notes. So there's a bit of confusion there about when, for me now anyway, there's confusion there about when something applies from the sporting regs and when something applies from the event notes. And again, it's a new area of inconsistency that makes a lot of previous decisions questionable. And I don't know what it is ultimately, but the system they have now isn't working. It's not been working for several years now. You look at Abu Dhabi and the fact that they wouldn't change the result. The stewards were not empowered to feel they could change the result. And, ultimately they used a load of fluff to get out of changing the result. The stewards can always do that. They can always fluff the regulations somehow if they want now. It's quite clear clear to me that they can do that. I mean, they could just come back and, justify anything with this, Article 15.3 that they use to say that the race director can do what he wants, essentially. That is the sign of a broken system that needs changing, because now it just seems like it's ultimately a case of whatever the FIA are feeling. It's not something that's being ran in a consistent and fair way. And part of that is the fact that nobody is there who can hold the FIA accountable. They don't recognise several jurisdictions like the CAS, so the sports arbitration courts or anything like that. So there's literally no external people who can look into FIA decisions consistently and hold them accountable. It's all about their own internal courts and things, and the FIA Court of Appeal. And for whatever reason, they tried to make changes. Those changes aren't working. I just think fundamentally right now, the sporting body is in a bit of a crisis. I mean, we hear as well F1 rumors of F1 looking at ways they can break away from the FIA. So it's not just us fans who feel that the FIA are doing a really bad job at running the sport at the moment. It seems to run within Formula One employees as well, and ultimately Formula One management must think that some of the FIA's decisions are harming their brand. And I don't know what the solution is, but what is happening right now, I think, is fundamentally we see it getting worse, not better, even though they're making all these changes. And the new FIA president as well doesn't fill you with much confidence, especially the way he's been behaving and speaking in
Jordan,
things.
I was gonna add, he's come out and made some sarcastic comments about like how it's hard to find race directors and you can't just go on Amazon. But Jordan, honestly, these race directors, they must not even be from Amazon. They must be from Gumtree or eBay or one of those other Wish, maybe. You're right.
Yeah, because definitely Wish.
Oh man, just like how they get it so like it's not even a little bit wrong. It's like fatally, catastrophically. It's like a disastrous monstrosity of being wrong. Like it's nuts to me. It's so absurd.
But that's the thing. Like, so you can say that. I can't find race directors that don't make mistakes or whatever. Is essentially what he's trying to say. Nobody's expecting someone not to make a mistake, but you need mistakes always happen in sports, especially referees. Obviously, you look at football; it's happening all the time. That's why they introduced VAR, because you need a system that can rectify those mistakes on the fly as they happen. It's not necessarily about the people; it's about the structure that the FIA are using, and especially when we got a stewarding team that don't want to change results. And they've done that multiple times now, where you could easily argue the results should be changed. And part of me thinks that fear in the stewards dates back to the Canadian Grand Prix in 2019, when Sebastian was given that 5-second penalty, which cost him the race, and the stewards basically handed the race in the stewards' room to Lewis. I don't think we've ever had that sort of correction happen again since that moment. And if you remember, there was a huge backlash on social media about that from the Ferrari side of things and the Tifosi. And you saw at the time, the stewards came out and said comments like, I received threats and I received, abuse and stuff on social media. And I think that sort of thing drilled a fear into them that unfortunately they're now afraid to actually do the right thing, because they don't want to be seen as the ones deciding the result of a race. But I mean, if that's the case, then we don't have a sport that can basically be judged as a sport anymore, because it's not a sport with rules that are applied. So yeah, I think the whole system needs to be looked at, and whether we get rid of the stewarding team, we have something different instead of a stewarding team, because to me, the stewards are a vital aspect of the Abu Dhabi controversy that was overlooked, that also contributed to what happened. So yeah, something needs to change. I don't know what it is exactly, but I think, Ben's comments are not helpful at all. And it just sounds like, essentially refusing again to accept responsibility for what's happened. And sadly, I don't see much changing under his leadership, but here we are.
Well, that's the thing as well, Jordan. And I'm gonna circle back to another point you made in that great response too, about maybe the stewards feeling a fear because of the backlash they might get publicly. But at the end of the day, everybody experiences some form of backlash, and even we talked on it ironically earlier today as well about you receiving backlash and abuse from people. At the end of the day, whilst they are human, and I will have a human kind of compassion for them, Jordan, I'm not gonna feel sorry for them in a sense that they're exposed to things like that, because for them, they're at the pinnacle of motorsport. F1 prides itself on being the pinnacle of motorsport, being the ultimate series you need to get into. And it's a sport, Jordan, with plenty of money. We even saw, again, earlier on in the year when we were at Jeddah, when you had the missile strikes, and obviously the likes of Stefano Domenicali and Russ Braun, they picked financial gain almost over the well-being of the drivers. So,
Yeah.
they have money. And it's not to say that death threats are acceptable or nice. Nobody should be, do it. At the end of the day, it's a sport, and like if things don't go in your team's favor, but it's because, like something happened and the rules were applied correctly, it's natural to feel upset, but it's not natural, I would say, to go about abusing people or sending people death threats. That's unacceptable, and that's where the line gets crossed. But at the same time, I think the FIA needs to be more stubborn. If they were stubborn in applying the rules correctly, I don't think we'd have an issue. But it's the fact that they're actually more stubborn in doing things the wrong way, and then actually when they're questioned about it, then them kind of slapping us in the face and telling us why they did it wrong and why they'll never change it, so absurd to me. But I think also bringing it into my next question, Jordan, for me these days, I find myself watching other series. I won't lie to you. There was a period of time where I just used to watch F1, and that was my jam. And like, there's no other series I was interested in. My dad would be downstairs watching the Motogp, and you'd see Valentino Rossi, Sete Gibernal, Max Biaggi, Casey Stoner, Hayden, bless him. Like, and that probably shows my age as well. But yeah, just like, like there were so many different series that I just used to kind of just put a middle finger up to. But now, to be honest, Jordan, I'm watching the IndyCar, I'm watching GT3, we've got Le Mans taking place in 2 hours as well. I just want to ask you, like, are there any series you're watching at the moment, and maybe series that you like that our fans could check out too, whilst Mercedes are trying to sort their season out?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been a massive MotoGP fan as well. So when you mentioned Valentino Rossi, I was a big Rossi fan for several years and followed his career. And more recently, I've been following Fabio Quartararo, who's also Team LH and a big friend of Lewis's. And he's basically now a rising star in MotoGP, and I've started to follow his career. He won the championship last season. I mean, coming to this season, with a Yamaha bike that nobody really expected anything from, because they had a lot of issues, especially with their straight line speed and their engine power. We've actually seen Fabio in the recent months string together a few really good results and get a few victories in, which has basically now turned his championship around. He leads the championship. So I'm following his career, hoping that he can become one of the greats in MotoGP. And certainly while Marquez is out of the sport and struggling with his injury and not able to compete at the front, for me, he is probably the greatest prospect, new young prospect that MotoGP's had for some time. So I'm really enjoying following that, to be honest. While obviously we're not getting much joy out of F1 and Mercedes at the moment, I'm enjoying those races, and MotoGP races always have plenty of entertainment value in them. So it's a good series to watch for sure. I do watch Formula E as well, just to keep track of what Mercedes are doing. Obviously, it's their last season as a works team. They're only here for a few years, but they've had a pretty successful time of it, even though they only arrived on the scene recently. And Nick de Vries and Stoffel quite regularly challenge to win races and things, and I quite enjoy following their story as well. But I appreciate Formula E is maybe not for everyone. I mean, it's another FIA sport where there's a lot of questionable decisions in it as well. But obviously the nature of the sport in that it's small electric vehicles that are basically standardized aerodynamics. So actually, the entire bodywork of the Formula E car is fake. It doesn't have any outside aero influence. And they're not particularly impressive to watch, I don't think. And the walls being really narrow causes loads of stupid collisions and things. And there isn't much flow to a Formula E weekend. But I always see that as it's not a sport maybe for motoring purists, but it's still at the end of the day something to watch that's quite entertaining and can be quite entertaining at times. So I've always followed Formula E, and I see why people are critical of it sometimes, but for me it's okay. I mean, I don't hate it. I would like to see Formula E use more innovation with the technology side. That's one of the main problems for me, is that they use standardized batteries and things. But yeah, I guess going on a tangent here a bit. And to us, in terms of motorsports, that's about it these days, really. I do watch Le Mans when it's on, so I'll be watching this weekend to see who wins the most spectacular race in the world. But I don't follow the World Endurance Championship religiously, other than that race. But yeah, that's it basically.
No, well, you mentioned some really cool things there as well, there, Jordan, and it was interesting to get your take just on where Formula E is at the moment, where it stands, and I actually feel it should get a bit more respect than it does too, because it's something alternative. And people, we had Sebastian Vettel, like I'm sure you remember this, come to England a couple of weeks ago to do question time. And one of the fans asked him in the audience, like, "Are you not a hypocrite because you're preaching about saving the environment and going about racing in a more clean way, but you're driving a Formula One car?" And whilst obviously the Formula One fan in me was like, "Oh, this person doesn't know what they're speaking about. The V6 hybrid is the most fuel efficient, power efficient engine in the world." That's true, but then when you look at the rest of the circus that follows Formula One, just to make a race happen, just to make a Formula One car turn on, there's so much equipment and so much stuff and so much kind of, things that go into making a race happen that, could be improved maybe in the way that's run. And with Formula E, you've got that. You've got a car that essentially is kind of like net carbon neutral. It's not really damaging the environment further, and at least because it's not as vigorous as Formula One, you don't need huge trucks, huge kind of teams of hundreds of data analysts and stuff like that. It feels quite grassroots, and even for somebody like me that doesn't watch it religiously but I'm aware of it, it's just refreshing. It is refreshing. And then, like you mentioned too, there are very popular names in there. We've had obviously Stoffel Van Dorn, which looks like he might be on his way to win Mercedes' last championship in Formula E for this year. You've got Nick de Vries, which he's sniffing around for a seat, and I would gladly like to see that Nutella merchant moved out of Williams. De Vries get a chance there at Williams. So it's nice that you get familiar faces in series like that. And also, what I was going to ask, this is a leading question for MotoGP there, Jordan, is I know that it's a completely different sport. We're talking about the transition from 4 wheels to 2 or 2 to 4, but is there anything that you see in the way that MotoGP races are ran, stewarded, promoted, that you think F1 could take a page out of their books from?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I think for whatever reason, incidents in MotoGP are a lot less frequent, so the inconsistencies naturally don't occur as often. Just 'cause I think collisions and things in MotoGP are less likely overall, and the riders tend to be a bit more respectful to each other as well, just because the nature of the danger element of it, I think. And so there's nothing in particular that stands out in my mind other than the fact that for whatever reason the stewarding team don't have particularly big names, so you don't really hear about them. They just silently go on about their job in the background, and you don't really hear in the media a lot of comments from some of these stewards or these FIM people. They kind of do a much more quieter job, in my opinion, than the FIA. And I think that's part of the reason why the FIA is like it is, because of all the politics that happen, and politics take a forefront the stage of Formula One all the time. I mean, it's become basically a major element of it. But MotoGP's never had that same politics for whatever reason. It just seems to be ran more like you'd expect, where the officials just do their job and get on with it. And that's just the way I've always seen it. I don't know if you agree with that, but
I definitely agree. Yeah, it really does, Jordan. I was going to say as well, we also had the likes of Molly from our community and F1 Blag as well on the topic of IndyCar. And it's so interesting you mentioned those things about MotoGP, Jordan, because you follow it more closely than I do, that in comparison to IndyCar, it's a similar vibe too. Like the drivers don't really have like a beef with each other. There's more common respect between them because the media don't like make it their job to kind of spread fake rumors or make fake narratives or rivalries between them. Genuinely, you see that like it's a lot more organic and like harmonious, and things are just dealt with on the track right there and then. There's not this whole thing of like decisions being made outside the sport, and like this whole thing with like like the media companies, and just the way how political the FIA as well are, with the governing body being the government body as well. And yeah, I agree with you that like it's weird how actually the sports which are seemed as lesser actually have better fundamental principles when it just comes to the sport being a sport. And you're able to tune in, whether it's you go there and you watch the race in person, or you watch on TV and you get your time's worth. Whereas with F1, I think sadly, like you mentioned, it's one of those things where you could just never tell. Now you could see somebody do something really wrong, and the FA to say, yeah, you know what, can't be asked, innit? We'll just change the rules, and we'll just let this one slide. It's nuts to me, and I'm glad you pointed that out as well. And also, Jordan, like I'm so happy we've had you on today's episode too, because you've given us some really unique and intriguing takes that I don't think we would normally get. And we definitely need to get you back on for another episode. So before I round up the show as well, Jordan, I just wanted to check in with you as well and find out, we've obviously got Azerbaijan qualifying soon. I'm not quite sure when Georgina will release this episode. So it may be the case that the episode gets dropped and the Azerbaijan Grand Prix and the race and the results and whatever backlash comes with it's already happened. But what's your prediction for quali based on the FP3 or FP times that we've seen so far? And what do you see the top three running looking like, with the safety car being quite, prominent at this race too?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm just sticking with the pattern that seems to have emerged over the last few months. I'm going to predict that Charles will put it on pole in that Ferrari because, they do seem to have the quali pace, if nothing else. But yeah, I expect there'll be lots of safety cars and things. And ultimately, I think that will shape the race. And I'm going to hopefully predict that Checo will win the race over Leclerc and Max somehow. It'll all probably come down to the strategy at the end of the day for this one, ultimately, because of, like you say, the reasons. Baku always springs a surprise. So that's what I'd go for in terms of the win. In terms of Mercedes, unfortunately, they look out of it completely, almost a second back so far. So and I don't see any drastic change coming between qualifying and for the race, which will put us back in it. So really, it's another damaged imitation weekend for Mercedes. I guess we just got to hope that the drivers have a pretty good quality and get what they want out of the car, what they can get out of the car, what's there. And then the chaos of the race gives us something we didn't expect and, benefits us. But I can't really predict where Mercedes will be ultimately because they look further down the midfield, but who knows? It's
yeah, sorry, Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just been the crazy way the season's gone, really, that sometimes we're the best of the rest and sometimes we're just nowhere. Just a really frustrating thing.
Yeah, I definitely feel your vibes on that one as well, Jordan, because it's just one of those ones where it's like you tune into it as a Mercedes fan. You're just like, well, what am I watching? Because, we're not really challenging for the wins, but then again, we're far enough ahead, thankfully, of the other midfield team. So I notice even the race directors, they don't really give us too much TV time, which is a bit sad, but I guess it's to be expected with us not being fully there yet. But it will come, like you mentioned, and I think there is hope still that eventually at some point it has to change, of course. But Jordan, as well, I just want to say, huge thank you for your time as well, man. Because I see you, for me, I just consider myself a normal guy from North London. But for you, I see you as one of like the pioneers and one of the forefront members just of our community and what you've been able to do and just the kind of insight and knowledge that people can gain just by listening to you and checking you out as well, Jordan. So I wanted to give you the floor and just say, is there anything interesting that we can expect to look forward from you in the next couple weeks or months that you're working on currently, and also for the listeners at home that they're listening to you for the first time and this is their first experience kind of interacting with you. Where can they find you on the social medias?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm just at F1_Jordan on Twitter. If you want to follow me on there, and basically every race weekend I'll just be chatting nonsense about F1
Mate,
and
still better than Sky Sports though. Just put that out there too.
yeah. Come for unbiased views, and especially a lot of comments about Sky Sports and Red Bull and Christian Horner. If you like that kind of thing. But yeah, nothing particular planned at the moment. But just living life, running my account, and yeah.
Well, you say that as well, man. You've got Silverstone to look forward to in July, or just a month away from that.
Yeah. So I'm going to Silverstone, so I will be covering that, I guess, on my social feed. So last year I basically posted so many videos and things. I think people appreciate that. So I will be doing that again and try and capture that atmosphere. And then about 3 or 4 weeks later, I'll be off to the Hungarian Grand Prix as well. So I'll be covering that.
Man, you're flying.
It'd be good to meet as much as Team LH as I can while I'm out and about. So if you bump into me, just say hello. It's kind of crazy. Like last year, when I was at the GP, a few people recognized me and noticed me and said hello to me. It's kind of crazy. It's walking about and having people know who you are, and not necessarily I didn't know who some of those people were instantly either until I spoke to them. And I guess that's just kind of the crazy thing I've got to expect. And now I've got 30k followers. They'll probably be even more crazy at Silverstone this year. So I might have to go around wearing a disguise or something. So people are constantly stopping me. But I know I'm happy to chat to people if you see me around and stuff. So yeah, looking forward to that. And although we don't have much expectations this year, I still at the end of the day love seeing Lewis on track, and that's an experience that not many people get to enjoy, and I've enjoyed it several times. So I'm just going to enjoy again, seeing the GOAT out on track in it might not be the best car, but it's still a Formula One car, and it's still what he is the greatest at doing. So just enjoy the weekend really, regardless of what happens, and I'm not going to let the results bother me too much. Just soak up the atmosphere, I think, is the only way you can really approach it, to be honest.
Oh, exactly. And that's the thing as well, Jordan. I mean, we as obviously Lewis fans would like to see him finish his career on a high, of course. He deserves so much with what he's given to the sport and the entertainment he's given us as fans and followers. But like you said too, I guess there are times where you just have to be humble, and even if we're not winning at the moment, it's still, like you said, an achievement. And just we're watching history before our own eyes, man. With a driver with the caliber of Lewis's achievements, still out on track, still doing it week in, week out, and he doesn't look tired either. He's not, again, no shade at Kimi either, but he wants to be there. You can see that he's still hungry. You hear stories from people that work at the factory saying that he's putting in extra hours. He's sacrificing his own car and putting additional sensors on it just so George can drive the normal car, and he, as the talisman of the team, can collect the data, and use his experience to good kind of purchase. So like you said, and also I'm looking forward to watching those vlogs and videos that you make at Silverstone, Hungary as well, man. And it'll be great to have you back, on the podcast as well, to get your first-hand experiences, how those races were live in the flesh, because unfortunately I'm not getting to go to any Grand Prix this year, so I have to live, vicariously through you guys. And Jordan as well, man, mega. You're just such a star. We all look up to you. We're super proud of you as well for the way you carry yourself, because it's easy, to have that lapse and, to feed into what the trolls want, and say something that you might live to regret later. But, you're one of the most kind of well articulated and just down to earth people. I couldn't think of a better person that deserves it, man. So I'm so happy for you. And
Thank you very
just
much.
generally, man, I know you're going to be around Silverstone Ah, man, it's the truth, you know. And also, I know you're gonna be at Silverstone with your Nigel Mansell mustache as a disguise.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, disguise. You know, like of course, keep it respectful. But yeah, if you see F1 Jordan there, say hello. He doesn't bite, at least to my knowledge. So
No,
yeah,
I
you know,
don't.
just good to know because I heard that there's a driver on the grid currently wearing some fake gold boots that is threatened to
Oh
headbutt
yeah.
some media in the past. So yeah, thankfully we don't advocate for those things. We're not a
Yeah.
violent podcast here. But of course, it's amazing just to see what you're achieving, what you're doing, what you're giving back to the community. And yeah, just thank you for your time, Jordan, as always. And unless there's any final words you wanted to say.
Just thank you for having me. It's been really enjoyable chatting. I'd love to come back and do it again at some point. So yeah, thanks.
Oh, excellent. Well, you know what Georgina's going to say. She's going to say yes. And you already got my endorsement, man. So thank you. And then, yeah, guys, if you're tuning in, please make sure, as usual, you go and check out our guests. So this week, check out Jordan. And, he's mentioned his ads and Georgina as well in the YouTube, the SoundCloud. Do we use SoundCloud? Not yet, but maybe. Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We'll put his details and all of his social media handles there too for you guys to go and follow, show him some love and show us some love as well, man. Jeez, just don't leave us hanging. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, Stripping the Dipping. Make sure you follow the Twitter page as well. We need 100 subscribers or 100 followers, man. So make sure you get us to 100 followers so I can get my ice cream. Georgina's got some ice cream for me, and we're in the British summer, so I need my ice cream or else I'm gonna melt. So make sure you subscribe to all of our platforms. And yeah, just if you know of anybody that would be great to come on the podcast, please reach out to Georgina and we can set that up. If you, as listener, want to come on and get your stuff off on the podcast, be great to listen and get your takes on it as well. But until next time, guys, enjoy it, be safe, have fun. Peace, love, prosperity, all the good stuff. And it's been DJ DENZ. And we hit another one, in the great words of DJ Khaled, with our superstar guest, F1 Jordan. Thank you as always. And until next time, guys, we'll catch you again. Peace.